Every other rancher at the depot that October morning wanted a boy who could lift a hay bale and answer a question without hesitation. And Elias Ward stood at the back of the crowd on the platform in Prairie Bend, Nebraska, watching them pick over the children lined up in front of the orphan train, the way men picked over cattle at auction, and felt something twist in his chest that had nothing to do with the ranch work he had actually come for. The Children's Aid Society had brought 31 children west that year from the tenements of New York, and by the time Elias arrived, most of the sturdy boys had already been claimed, hands shaken, papers signed, families walking off toward wagons with a new set of arms to work their land. What remained, sitting on the small wooden bench at the platform's far end while the crowd thinned, was a handful of children nobody had chosen. Among them, a boy of perhaps 8, who had not moved from his seat the entire morning, had not answered when spoken to, had not so much as looked up when the other children were called forward, one by one, and did not return. "That one doesn't speak," said the woman standing nearest the bench, a placement agent in a plain traveling coat who introduced herself as Grace Ellery. Once Elias had drawn close enough to ask. "Hasn't said a word since we left New York. Far as any of us can tell. His name's Henry Doyle. There was a fire in his tenement building this past winter. He lost both parents in it. He was found 3 days later in the building next door, having not spoken since, and the society's doctor believes there's nothing physically wrong with him. Only that whatever he saw that night took the words from him and hasn't given them back." Elias looked at the boy, thin and pale and entirely still on the bench, staring at some point past the platform that nobody else could see, and understood, with a certainty that surprised him, that he was looking at grief wearing a smaller body than his own, but shaped from exactly the same material. "He won't be much use to you, Mr. Ward," Miss Ellery said, not unkindly, simply factually, the way a woman speaks when she has placed enough children to understand which matches tend to succeed and which tend to fail. "Most of the families here today are looking for a hand that can work. I'd be doing you a disservice not to say so plainly." "I didn't come here today looking for a hand," Elias said, which was not entirely true, since that had been exactly his intention when he rode into town that morning, but which became true the moment he said it out loud, watching the boy's still unblinking face. "I believe I came looking for whoever nobody else was going to choose." Miss Ellery studied him for a long moment, the careful, evaluating look of a woman whose entire profession depended on judging a stranger's character quickly and accurately. "You lost someone yourself," she said. "It wasn't a question." "My wife, 2 years back," Elias said. "Childbirth. We lost the baby, too. I've been alone on that ranch since, telling myself I needed a hired hand, when I expect what I've actually needed is considerably harder to hire for." Grace Ellery looked at Henry, then back at Elias, and something in her expression shifted from professional caution toward something warmer, though still guarded, the particular caution of a woman who had seen good intentions fail before and had learned not to trust them too quickly, regardless of how sincerely they were offered. "The society requires a home visit within the month to confirm the placement is suitable," she said. "And I should tell you now, Mr. Ward, that our guidelines generally prefer a 2-parent household for a child with needs as particular as Henry's. A single man running a ranch alone isn't the arrangement we typically approve, whatever your intentions." "I understand that," Elias said. "I'd still like to try, if the boy's willing." Grace crouched down in front of Henry, speaking low and gentle in a way that told Elias she had done this exact thing many times before, for many children, with impatience that had clearly cost her something over the years to maintain. "Henry," she said, "this is Mr. Ward. He's got a ranch outside town, horses and cattle, and he'd like you to come stay with him, if that's something you'd want. You don't have to say anything. You can just take my hand if you're willing, or shake your head if you're not." Henry looked at Elias for the first time. A long, searching look from a child who had clearly learned, in ways no 8-year-old should have to learn, to assess a grown man's face for danger before anything else. And after a long moment, he reached out and took Grace's offered hand, then, more slowly, looked toward Elias, and did not pull away, when Elias, crouching to the boy's eye level the way Grace had, extended his own hand in turn. "That's a yes," Grace said quietly, "as much of one as he gives these days." Not everyone in Prairie Bend approved of the choice. The Reverend Alcott stopped Elias outside the Mercantile the following week with the particular concerned frown of a man who believed he was offering wisdom rather than discouragement. "A boy who doesn't speak may never speak." "Elias," Reverend Alcott said. "Some of the doctors call it simpleness. Whatever kindness the society dresses it up in, you do well to consider whether you're equipped to raise a child who may never properly work this land or hold a normal conversation with you, rather than one of the sturdier boys who went home with the Hendersons or the Millers the same morning. He's not simple," Elias said. "He's grieving, same as any of us grieve, only he's carrying it in silence instead of words. I don't recall anyone in this town telling me I was simple for going quiet myself the year after Sarah died." "That's different," the Reverend said. "It isn't," Elias said, and walked on. And though the exchange left him unsettled for days afterward, it also settled something else in him more firmly. A conviction that whatever the town's doubts, he had chosen correctly on that platform, and intended to prove it through patience rather than argument. The Ward Ranch sat on 400 acres of good grass at the edge of the Platte River Valley, worked until 2 years before by Elias and his wife Sarah together, the two of them having built the operation up from a homestead claim and a single team of horses into something that had by the time Sarah died become genuinely prosperous enough that Elias had money for hired help and no particular need for it beyond the hollow ache of an empty house that no amount of labor seemed able to fill. He had told himself, riding into Prairie Bend that morning, that a boy from the orphan train would give him an extra set of hands for the coming winter. He understood, riding home with Henry silent and watchful in the wagon seat beside him, that he had actually gone looking for something considerably harder to name. Henry did not speak in the weeks that followed, though he watched everything with the careful, assessing attention of a child who had learned that watching kept you safer than trusting. And Elias, for his part, made no attempt to force conversation, having learned something similar himself in the 2 years since Sarah's death, that grief did not respond well to being hurried along by other people's impatience. "He's not being difficult," Elias told his neighbor, Orrin Castell, who had stopped by in November and watched Henry work silently alongside Elias in the barn, without once speaking. "He's being exactly as quiet as he needs to be right now. I know something about that myself." Castell, a plain, practical man who had known Elias since before Sarah, considered this with the particular respect one grieving man extends to another. "Some boys need more time than others," he said. "You've got the patience for it, if anybody does. You've had 2 years of practice being patient with your own silence." The first sound Henry made in the house, other than the ordinary business of eating and moving and existing, came in the deep cold of a November night, a sound that was not words at all, but a raw, wordless cry that woke Elias from sleep and brought him down the hall to find the boy sitting bolt upright in bed, eyes wide and unseeing, caught somewhere between the dream and the room, both fists pressed against his own ears as though trying to block out a sound only he could still hear. Elias did not touch him at first, understanding from some instinct he could not fully explain that a frightened child, freshly out of a nightmare about fire, needed to see a calm presence before he needed to feel a hand on his shoulder. He sat down on the floor at a careful distance, in the boy's line of sight, and simply stayed there, saying nothing, letting his own steady stillness do whatever work steadiness could do in a dark room at 3 a.m. It took the better part of 20 minutes before Henry's breathing slowed, before his fists unclenched from his ears, before his eyes gradually began to see the actual room around him rather than whatever the dream had shown him instead. He looked at Elias, sitting patiently on the floor in his nightshirt in the cold, and something in his small face crumpled, not into more crying, but into the particular exhausted relief of a child who has just understood, perhaps for the first time since the fire, that someone was going to stay nearby, regardless of how bad the night got. Elias moved a little closer, slow, the way he approached a spooked horse, and when Henry did not flinch away, he sat beside him against the headboard, not touching, simply present, until the boy's breathing evened into something close to sleep again. "I'm not going anywhere," Elias said quietly, more to fill the silence gently than because he expected an answer. "Whatever you saw, whatever you're still seeing some nights, I'll be right here, same as I was tonight, for as long as you need me to be." Henry did not answer, not that night, but he leaned, very slightly, the smallest fraction of an inch, against Elias's side before sleep finally took him. And Elias sat there in the cold for another hour after the boy had drifted off, unwilling to move and risk waking him, understanding that whatever had shifted in that room was worth considerably more than a night's lost sleep. The breakthrough, when it came, arrived not through any deliberate effort on Elias's part, but through a green colt that Elias had been working in the round pen one December afternoon, a nervous, difficult animal that had fought every attempt at gentling until Henry, watching from the fence rail as he watched everything, climbed down without being invited and walked toward the colt with the same slow, careful stillness he brought to every interaction with the world since the fire. Elias, alarmed, started to call the boy back, worried for his safety around an animal that had already thrown 2 grown men that week, and then stopped, because the colt, rather than shying from the boy's approach, had gone still itself, ears forward, watching Henry with the particular quality of attention animals sometimes reserved for creatures they recognize as being every bit as wary of the world as they are. Henry stood at the colt's shoulder for a long time, not touching it, simply standing, and the colt lowered its head slowly until its nose nearly brushed the boy's chest, and Elias, watching from the fence, understood he was witnessing something he did not have adequate words for himself. 2 frightened, careful creatures finding in each other's stillness something that resembled trust. "Easy, boy," Elias said softly, uncertain whether he meant the colt or Henry, and perhaps meaning both. Henry reached up slowly and laid his hand flat against the colt's neck, and the animal did not startle, and for the first time since the platform in Prairie Bend, Elias saw something move across the boy's face that was unmistakably, unbearably close to peace. Grace Ellery visited monthly, as the society required, and each visit Elias found himself watching for her arrival with an attention that went well beyond the professional courtesy the situation strictly demanded. And by January, he understood, with the particular clarity that arrives to grieving men usually later than it should, that he had begun looking forward to those visits for reasons that had very little to do with Henry's placement report. "He's improved considerably since October," Grace said, sitting at the kitchen table in January with her ledger open, watching Henry through the window as he worked alongside Elias at the corral, not speaking, but clearly present in a way he had not been at the platform. "The society will want to see continued progress before final placement is confirmed in the spring." She looked up at Elias. "I should also tell you, since I've been coming here monthly for 3 months now, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise, that the society's preference for a 2-parent household remains a real concern for Henry's permanent placement. Whatever progress you've made with him individually, what would satisfy that concern Elias asked, though he suspected, watching her face, that he already understood the shape of the answer before she gave it. A wife, generally, Grace said, with a particular careful neutrality of a woman choosing her words, with real caution. Though I'll admit, Mr. Ward, that's an unusual thing to discuss so plainly with the rancher whose placement report I meant to be filing objectively. You could call me Elias, he said, given how plainly we appear to be discussing things. Grace looked at him for a long moment, something in her professional caution giving way, slowly, to something else. And Elias understood, watching her, that whatever had begun for him somewhere around the second monthly visit had not been entirely one-sided. I've placed 40-some children in 3 years doing this work, Grace said finally. I've learned to be careful about which families I trust, with my own hopes for how a placement will turn out. Because hoping too hard makes the disappointments considerably worse when they come. She was quiet a moment, looking out at Henry, rather than at Elias. I had a younger brother once, she said. He didn't survive the crossing when our family came over from Ireland. The fever took him somewhere in the middle of the ocean. And my mother never fully recovered from watching it happen, with no way to help him. I took this work, I think, because I couldn't save him. And some part of me has spent every placement since trying to save someone else instead, as though it might balance some old account that never actually needed balancing in the first place. She looked out the window at Henry, laying his hand once more against the colt's neck. I did not expect to find myself hoping quite this hard about this particular placement, Elias. And I'll admit, it's made these monthly visits considerably more complicated than my supervisor would prefer. Complicated how? Elias asked. I look forward to them more than professional objectivity strictly allows, Grace said, and something in the plain honesty of the admission, offered without flirtation or artifice. The same unadorned directness she brought to everything settled a question in Elias's chest that he had been circling without permitting himself to land on directly since November. The trouble arrived in February, in the form of a letter from Chicago, addressed to the Children's Aid Society and forwarded to Grace, from a man identifying himself as Henry's uncle, Patrick Doyle, his late father's older brother, who had, according to the letter, only recently learned through society records that his brother's son had survived the tenement fire and been placed out west, and who now wished to claim the boy as his own ward, citing blood relation and buried within several paragraphs of expressed familial concern, a clear and unmistakable interest in the labor a growing boy might eventually provide on his own modest farm outside Chicago. He's got a legal claim, Grace told Elias, showing him the letter on her next visit, her face troubled in a way Elias had not seen from her before. Blood relation generally supersedes an unconfirmed placement in the society's own guidelines, particularly since Henry's placement here hasn't been formally finalized yet, pending exactly the concern I raised with you in January. Elias read the letter twice, and something in its careful performed concern, so clearly calculated for an audience it expected to read it, struck him as wrong in a way he could not immediately articulate, the same wrongness he had once learned to recognize in a horse trader's overly smooth patterback before Sarah died, when he had still been young enough to need the lesson taught to him the hard way. This man never once inquired after his nephew in the 8 months since the fire, Elias said. Never wrote, never sent for him, never so much as confirmed the boy survived until society records happened to cross his notice. Now, 8 months later, he wants him back. He looked at Grace. That's not grief finally catching up with a man, Grace. That's a farmer doing arithmetic about free labor once he learned there was a boy of working age available for the claiming. I share your suspicion, Grace said, but suspicion isn't proof, and the society's guidelines don't currently favor an unmarried rancher's placement over a blood relative's claim, whatever either of us privately believes about the relative's motives. Then we need proof, Elias said, or we need to change the one thing standing against this placement that we actually have the power to change ourselves." Grace looked at him, understanding arriving in her face slowly, then all at once. "Elias Ward," she said, "are you proposing marriage as a legal strategy in the middle of a custody dispute? I'm proposing marriage because I've wanted to since roughly December, when you started arguing with me about proper feeding schedules for a colt that wasn't even yours to worry over," Elias said. "The custody dispute simply happens to have arrived at a moment when saying so plainly has become considerably more urgent than my own natural slowness about these things would otherwise have allowed. That is," Grace said, laughing despite the seriousness of the letter still in her hand, "very possibly the least romantic proposal I have ever heard delivered with such obvious sincerity." "Is it a yes?" Elias asked. "It was already going to be a yes before Patrick Doyle's letter arrived," Grace said. "You've simply saved us both several more months of circling around it separately." They were married within 3 weeks, a small ceremony in Prairie Bend's church witnessed by Orrin Castell and half the society's regional office, and the completed marriage certificate, filed alongside a new, formal petition for permanent guardianship, went out to the Society's central office in Omaha, along with Grace's own detailed report, 3 months of careful documentation regarding Henry's progress, the colt, the slow return of trust in a boy who had lost everything in a fire that took both his parents and very nearly took his voice along with them, Patrick Doyle's competing claim, when the Society's investigator finally looked into it properly at Grace's insistence, unraveled quickly under closer examination. A farm in considerable debt, 2 other children already laboring past what any reasonable observer would call fair, and a complete absence of correspondence or concern in the 8 months between the fire and the moment Society records had made a working-age nephew newly visible to him. The petition was denied in April, the permanent placement confirmed in Elias and Grace's names together, and Patrick Doyle, informed of the decision by formal letter, did not contest it further, having concluded, presumably, that an 8-year-old boy who could not yet reliably speak was, on balance, not worth pursuing a costly legal fight to acquire. It was in May, in the round pen, with the same colt he had gentled through the winter, now grown calm and reliable under nearly daily handling, that Henry spoke his first words since the fire, so quietly that Elias, working nearby, very nearly missed them entirely. "Good boy," Henry said, to the colt, in a voice rough with disuse, but unmistakably a child's voice, plain and real, and entirely his own. Elias went very still, not wanting to startle whatever fragile thing had just occurred, and Henry, seeming to sense the weight of the moment despite his own apparent unawareness of having crossed some threshold, looked up at Elias with an expression that was almost, though not quite, a smile. "He talks to the horse," Elias said, 10 minutes later, standing in the kitchen doorway, watching Grace peel potatoes, still faintly stunned. Just now, out at the pen. 2 words. But 2 words, Grace. First time since October. Grace set down the knife and went very still herself, the particular stillness of a woman who had spent 3 years hoping carefully and had just been handed proof that the hoping had, this time, been entirely worth it. 2 words is where it always starts, she said, her voice thick. The rest tends to follow faster than people expect. Once the first crack opens, it did follow faster. By July, Henry was speaking in short, careful sentences, mostly about horses and cattle, and the particular quality of the Nebraska sky at evening. And by the following spring, a full 18 months after the platform in Prairie Bend, he had become, by any reasonable measure, an ordinary, chattering 9-year-old boy, his silence a receding memory, rather than a permanent condition. His laughter, when Elias finally heard it in full for the first time that August, startling both adults in the house nearly to tears. The Ward Ranch prospered in the years that followed, Henry growing into precisely the steady, capable young rancher that his early gift with the difficult colt had promised, Elias and Grace building a marriage that had begun, unconventionally, as a legal strategy in a custody dispute, and had become, in every ordinary sense that mattered, an entirely genuine partnership. A daughter, Sarah, named for Elias's first wife, with Grace's own full blessing, was born in their second year together, and Henry, by then 11, took to his baby sister with the same careful, watchful tenderness he had once reserved only for horses too frightened to trust anyone. On an evening in the autumn of their fourth year together, Grace found Elias at the corral fence watching Henry, now 12, working a young horse of his own with the same quiet, patient stillness that had first drawn Elias to him on a train platform 4 years before, and she came to stand beside him with Sarah asleep against her shoulder. "I think about that platform sometimes," she said. "All those ranchers looking for a strong pair of hands, and you, standing at the back, looking for the one child nobody else wanted." "I think about it often," Elias said. "I told myself I needed a hired hand. What I actually needed was proof that something broken could still be worth choosing, worth the patience it took to mend." He looked at Henry, calm and capable at the fence, worlds away from the silent, watchful boy on the bench. "I found that proof in him, before I ever admitted I needed it, Grace. And then I found it a second time in you, agreeing to marry a stranger for reasons that started as strategy and became, before either of us quite noticed, considerably more than that." Grace leaned into his shoulder, watching Henry, watching the mountains of light stretched gold across the Platte Valley in the last of the evening sun, and thought, not for the first time, that the children nobody else chose so often turned out to be the ones worth building an entire life around, if only somebody stayed still long enough and patient enough to let them arrive at trust in their own careful time.